At dawn on January 24, 1945, the world smelled like metal and cold. A low, bitter wind cut across the Camar pocket outside Housson, France, and the trees that ringed the frozen fields shivered under the concussion of enemy artillery. From the tree line came the sound every soldier feared: heavy engines grinding, the clank of treads over packed earth, and the hard, organized shuffle of men in column. 6 Tiger tanks rumbled forward, and behind them poured roughly 600 infantrymen. They were moving on 3rd Battalion. In the center of that storm, a single telephone wire unraveled across a white field, and a single man began to run with it. He was 25 years old, already marked by combat and by wounds the war had given him, an intelligence officer who wore medals quietly, and who had learned to measure terror in meters and seconds rather than words. His name, on paper, was First Lieutenant Garland Merl Connor. In the frozen light, he was less a name than an instrument, a link between the men in the foxholes and the guns that could turn a massed attack into a scattering of figures in the snow. The situation at the Camar pocket had hardened into something grim and mechanical. Operation Nordwind, the last major German offensive on the Western Front, had pushed into the Vosges and the Alsace Plain, and American units found themselves holding thin lines against determined and coordinated attacks. The 3rd Battalion was one of those units, dug in, exhausted, and short on depth. Snow crusted the top of the ground. Trenches were shallow. Cover was limited. Visibility was poor where the limbs of the forest bled shadow into the fields. In that gray, a human eye at the right place could mean the difference between withstanding a charge and being overrun. The German preparatory barrage came first, an invisible hammering that stripped trees bare and churned the mud beneath the snow. It broke apart the observer posts that had been measuring ranges. Later, when the runners came back across the open ground, the message they carried was thin and urgent. Their forward observation had been knocked out. No one remained in the forward posts who could see the enemy with the clarity needed to train artillery on the assembling columns. There was no time for debate. The battalion needed eyes forward, and in the absence of an observer, a man with a wire and a handset would have to do. Connor took the handset. He took nearly 400 yards of field telephone wire and slung it over his shoulder like a mantle. He tied one end into the wind and began to run. The crossing itself could have been written as a map of hazard. Open ground stretched between the American positions and the tree line from which the Germans poured. Artillery and mortar rounds began to fall in arcs that marked the air with thumping notes. Small arms chatter stitched the distance. Each step took him farther from the fragile safety of the battalion and into the kingdom of enemy observation and fire. He kept his head low, the wire sliding, the handset clutched, each breath visible in the cold air. There was a rhythm to the run, the wire unspooling behind him like a second life, his boots cutting into ice and frozen blades of grass, snowflakes blowing into his face. Shells hit around him with the brittle sound of glass breaking in the open. At one point, a young intelligence private crawled out from behind the lines, carrying extra wire across his shoulders, and matched Connor's stride. The private stayed close. His presence was less a spoken reassurance than a shared load. Later, that private would be wounded while helping secure the line of communication, another piece of detail that would be recorded in reports and in memory. Connor reached a shallow ditch roughly 30 yards ahead of the American line. It was not much, a depression that offered limited protection from direct fire, but a critical vantage point. Here, he began the work that would unspool the rest of that morning. He anchored the handset, ran the wire back toward the battalion command post in the fire direction center, and became, in practical terms, the eyes of every gun in range. Being a forward observer was method and math as much as courage. It required watching, estimating, transmitting, and correcting, over and over, while the world around you tried to make measurement meaningless. From that ditch, Connor called in the first corrections. The initial salvos were set up too far. The explosions thudded against the trees where the Germans waited. The first rounds landed beyond the nearest companies, scattering dirt and branches but not yet finding the massed men. He told them to adjust. The voice that carried those adjustments was not a sermon or a dare. It was a sequence of numbers and directions that converted sight into metal and steel into a new geography. Each correction tightened the net around the attacking formations. The second round cut into the German assembly area. Men fell or scattered. The momentum of the column slowed. But this was no smoothing of an error in a classroom. Each call came while shells were falling, while the trees were cracking under bombardment, while the metallic bass note of tank engines grew louder. Connor did not simply mark ranges. He watched the enemy respond. He saw infantry attempt to edge toward cover. He saw officers and indefinito in ranks trying to reform lines under the smoke. He called for more concentration where men massed and for adjusting fires when the aim was high or low. The artillery answered. The counter battery and supporting batteries threw steel into the gaps he pointed out. For the men in foxholes farther back, the noise swelled into a rolling percussion, and then there were the smaller, fearful sounds. The shout of a sergeant, the sudden cursing cry of a man who saw a comrade struck, the metallic scream of a spent round. As the minutes lengthened, the attack's shape changed. Infantry took casualties in the open and then shifted to find shelter behind the few folds of terrain. The field now was a patchwork of smoked-out furrows and broken trees. The German tanks, however, were a different class of threat. Tigers did not rely on hiding. They marched, with armor that shrugged off shrapnel and with guns that could punch through most American positions. The 105mm howitzers that the Americans had in battery could not simply lob a round through a Tiger's armor and expect the same result as with soft targets. The work against armor was more subtle. Disable tracks, wreck optics, frighten crews into abandonment. From his perch in the shallow ditch, Connor began to call adjustments not only for massed infantry, but for the increasingly close presence of armored vehicles. He gave bearings and ranged salvos to the fire direction center. He watched the effects. On some runs, shells found gaps between turrets and chassis, peppered tracks or found weak points in the treads. On others, rounds struck the ground beside tanks in danger-close patterns, throwing plumes of dirt and ice into the air and making crew members climb out to inspect or to repair. The aim was to slow and disorganize, to buy time and to blunt the coordinated advance of armor and men. The men under fire felt the difference that someone with a line could make. Where the enemy massed most heavily, the earth itself answered. Fields that had been open lanes filled with forbidding clouds of smoke and fragments. German formations that expected to roll forward found themselves having to crouch and recover. The infantry's forward momentum cut, staggered, and then sometimes halted, as artillery repeatedly chewed into assembly points and routes of approach. For the Americans, every correction that landed where Connor had pointed was a reprieve. But every correction also drew attention. When men on the other side of the wire adjusted to the sound of shells, the Germans, too, tried to locate the source of the blows. Artillery was not merely destructive, it was a form of signal. Whoever watched best could be hunted down. The danger was visible as the morning advanced. The Tigers crested an unseen rise and drove toward the American lines, engines growling, the horizon readjusting with each track. Connor could see the shadow of them through gaps in the trees. He relayed bearings for fire, counted the ranges, and watched the effects of each mission. Some Tigers were nudged into positions where the crews could no longer maneuver. Others showed damage to their running gear. Some crews dismounted to try emergency repairs. Smoke from tracks smoking, bits of armor bits blown off, and the occasional spray of fragments around a turret. These were the signs that a tank was no longer a machine of unchallenged dominance. Time became an instrument in Connor's hands. He measured by salvo cadence and by the small changes in enemy movement. 3 hours lay ahead that would be shaped by this interplay of sight and steel. But in the first hour, the battlefield was still deciding where it would break. From the ditch, Connor watched for the telltale patterns. A body of men pulled back, a tank that stalled, a group of officers trying to reorganize. Each observation required a fresh correction, a fresh order into the tiny phone microphone. Each correction put him fractionally closer to the enemy. At one point, as shells slit the air and the 105mm rounds crashed closer and closer to his position, a countervailing realization became clear. His forward position, chosen out of necessity, had become a magnet for artillery. The guns were learning their bearing from the impacts he called in. Enemy observers and the surviving elements of the attacking force were working to find the origin of the incoming fire. The ditch that had given him a view now offered less protection against specialist targeting. He remained where he was because to leave was to strip the battalion of its only functioning set of eyes. He kept correcting. He kept listening to the click of the handset and the grader's voice at the fire direction center, confirming adjustments, repeats, and salvos on the way. The noise around him continued to escalate. The deep rumble of tracked vehicles, the sharp bouquet of shrapnel, the intermittent answering rifle fire. At his back, men in the trenches felt the difference he was making. Ahead of him, the enemy felt its pressure. Then the Tigers moved closer. The engine's mood changed from a distant growl to a nearby metallic labored breathing. They came out of the trees one after another, like a plan refined and completed. The column that had seemed dangerous at a distance now coalesced into a direct threat, and the problem on the ground changed from breaking a mass of men to stopping armor and the infantry that supported it. This was the moment when the abstract became immediate. The artillery had to be purposefully dangerous to stop them. Rounds would have to fall nearer to the American lines and, inevitably, nearer to Connor's own position. The calculations were no longer about finding open ground. They were about how close was too close and whether that line could be crossed to save the battalion. He radioed for more concentrated fire. The guns answered, and the ground began to thunder with a violence that made the ditch's scant shelter seem insufficient. Each round that impacted within yards of his position sent a washing wave through him and the frozen earth. Splinters of ice and dirt peppered the lip of the ditch. The private who had run out with him kept to the edge and worked the wire, securing it under the weight of a mess kit and a grenade that someone had abandoned in haste. Men behind shouted at intervals, voices carried thinly across the noise, but none of that spoke to strategy. Only the sounds of the fight did. Up to this point, the communication between observer and battery had been a series of corrections and responses, range adjustments, bearing refinements, concentrated volleys against massed infantry. Now the calculus tilted. Armor required different effects, and the time that the battalion had to make those effects matter was shortening. The Tigers moved with purpose. The infantry tried to exploit every change in the fire pattern. The field telephone that Connor held was a fragile lifeline. If it failed, cut by shell fire, snapped by tracked vehicle, or simply severed by chance, the battalion would again be blind. The first major salvo that landed too close to the ditch smashed the surface to powder. Ice jumped like a shaken sheet. For the men in the trench, the world condensed into a series of crushing noises, and the small, ringing pains that followed. For Connor, it was a confirmation that the guns could indeed put metal where he needed it. It was also a warning that the margin of error was evaporating. He did not flinch from the implications. He continued to pass on corrections, to call for concentrations on the densest enemy groupings, and to request missions aimed at the tank's running gear. He watched for the black, oily plumes that marked a track as disabled. He noted when crews dismounted and tried in the middle of fire to mend what could be mended. He kept the line open, but the enemy was adaptive. They changed their formations to reduce exposure. They tried to mask themselves with the broken terrain and with their own smoke. They undertook small, violent sprints toward the American trenches, testing the protective curtain that artillery had been throwing between them. Each time men surged, the guns answered in a more concentrated and dangerous way. The distance between suppression and self-endangerment narrowed. It was in the press of that narrowing that Connor's role shifted from observer to a kind of living pivot. To keep the attack from overwhelming the line, fire had to fall ever closer to the defenders. To stop advancing armor, artillery had to be put where it could catch running gear and optics, often in so-called danger-close patterns, within yards of American positions. Each order to tighten fire brought shells nearer to the shallow ditch where he crouched. As the morning aged and the sun burned a thin path through the cloud cover, those within hearing understood they faced something beyond ordinary exposure. The battalion's survival depended more and more on the accuracy of the guns and on the unblinking work of the man on the wire. Connor's handset had already become the mechanism that converted sight and judgment into life-saving storms of steel. The question was not whether the guns were capable. The question was whether, in a landscape of human bodies and frozen soil, Those guns would be allowed to come so close that their own effects risked friendly positions. Somewhere in the stream of commands and replies, higher-level urgings moved through the communications net. There were acknowledgments from the Fire Direction Center, muted curses from the battery as they adjusted fuses and changes in quadrant elevation, rerouting of ammunition priorities. Orders and needs overlapped. Ammunition stocks were finite. Batteries were being tasked to do their utmost. But the sound of metal and the smell of powder remained the same instrument of survival. Connor listened, watched, and kept calling. He marked a tank that slowed and offered that data. He adjusted fire to hit where men massed and where tanks showed vulnerability. He felt the weight of each decision, not as a private thought he could dwell upon, but as a continuous, immediate duty. Sight, call, correct, repeat. Then, after a series of tight adjustments that began to show effect on the infantry, another development altered the geometry of the fight. The German armored vehicles that had been circling and probing closed in. One by one they presented themselves, no longer distant silhouettes but immediate hulking presences that loomed through the gaps in the trees. The scale of the threat recalculated in Connor's mind, as if someone had changed all the margins at once. He relayed another set of bearings. The battery responded with a concentrated mission. The result of that mission would prove pivotal, but its consequences had not yet been fully revealed. The sound of those rounds cut the air like a challenge, and all around the field men held their breath between impacts. At that exact point, with the tanks grinding nearer, with infantry trying to press into the softened areas and with artillery tightening its bite, Connor braced himself for the next series of orders. The ditch gave him line of sight. The wire gave him a voice. The guns gave him teeth. What remained to be seen was how close those teeth would have to come to the hand that fed them. If anyone in the lines that morning had a clearer sense than most that the day would be measured in yards rather than miles, it was Connor. He had put himself where he could see the enemy, and where he could coerce the guns into exacting a terrible price. He had already risked crossing 400 yards of open ground. He had already stood while rounds fell within arm's reach. The trench behind him was full of men who placed their lives in the pattern he was forming on the radio. What followed would demand decisions that could not be made purely by calculation. The next moves would strain the definitions of acceptable risk and would force a choice between holding a line and exposing those who held it to the very weapons meant to protect them. The call would be a test of whether one man could use artillery not just to blunt an advance, but to direct destruction into a place where his fellow soldiers stood. The field held its breath as the tanks lengthened the shadow across the snow and the gun crews relined for their next missions. If anyone still suspected the field would bend easily to calculation, the next 3 hours proved otherwise. The Tigers rolled in, the infantry pressed, and the pattern of fire and correction tightened into a relentless, inch-by-inch fight. From the shallow ditch, Connor continued to be the battalion's living instrument of aim. Salvo after salvo was adjusted by his voice through a copper wire that ran back to the Fire Direction Center. Numbers, deflections, corrections, each a small arithmetic that decided where metal would fall. At first, the missions sought assembly areas and routes of approach. Then they began to aim at breaking up the infantry that tried to slip behind fallen trees and hedgerows. The effect was immediate and visible. Groups of men that had moved like a tide were laced by shrapnel and smoke. Officers tried to form them into a spear again and failed, as bursts of earth erased pockets of cohesion. The artillery did what it was asked to do. It made the ground uncertain. It turned space into hazard, and it denied routes that the attackers hoped to use. Men fell where they ran. Others stalled and tried to melt into ruined terrain. Reports from the line, short, clipped, often delivered in the same channel Connor used, spoke of stunned Germans, of halted movement, and of the steady, grinding burden of returning the same corrections under fire. The tanks complicated everything. A 105mm round exploding against a Tiger might do little obvious structural damage, but a round placed against running gear, a track, a road wheel, or into the shallow earth near a hull could change the machine into an immobile trophy. Connor's calls began to concentrate on those vulnerable points. He watched for the small telling things, the flash of a track that no longer rolled freely, a black plume from a damaged engine, the way a turret stopped to allow crews to check under protection. On several occasions, Rounds punched close enough to throw ice and dirt onto the glacier's plates, and crews exposed themselves to see what had happened. In some cases, they climbed down to attempt jury-rigged repairs while shells still fell around them. With each successful adjustment, the momentum of the assault ebbed. Crews abandoned damaged Tigers and infantry bunched to cover them. Other vehicles slowed as drivers sought better angles, or as they tripped over broken ground. The 105s could not promise a quick destruction of heavy armor, but coordinated, repeated danger. Close fire could isolate vehicles, knock out mobility, blind vision blocks, and force crews to quit their machines. That was the pattern Connor sought to enforce: degrade the armored spear and sap the infantry's will to press against a rain of accurate steel. None of this unfolded without cost. At times, the German return fire grew precise. Enemy artillery and mortar observers, working with what depth of observation they still retained, pushed counter-battery and counter-fire that hunted for the origin of the American impacts. Shells came closer to Connor's ditch, sometimes landing just yards beyond it. Snow and soil that had once been a neutral medium were shredded into ragged skin, and the ditch's lip was pockmarked with the results. The private who had followed Connor with the extra wire was wounded while attempting to protect and secure the line of communication, a detail that entered the battalion's reports and would later be part of official summaries. He survived, but his injury underscored the fragility of the lifeline. As the hours accumulated, so did the signs that the attackers were paying a heavy price. Reports consolidated after the fight would later list 53 confirmed German dead in the immediate area, with estimates of total killed and wounded rising into the hundreds, over 150 by some accounts. Though those higher figures remained estimates rather than confirmed counts, American casualties were real and painful, but did not match the potential calamity that an armored breakthrough would have brought. The battalion had suffered losses and wounds. Medics and litter bearers worked under fire to reach men caught between firing points in shell-scarred fields. Yet, despite the cost, the line held. The most dangerous phase came as German armor and infantry tightened their approach to within yards of the American positions. That proximity demanded a kind of tactical audacity that changed the calculus of safety. The batteries, already stretched and working under severe demand, were asked to compress and time their fire where small adjustments could mean the difference between grazing friend and striking foe. The phrases used over the wire were clinical: danger close, fire for effect, adjust left 200, drop 6 rounds. But the measured words masked an extraordinary fact. The rounds were landing where American men stood. The physics of the battlefield had narrowed into a slender margin between suppression and death, Connor persisted. He continued to watch and to convert observation into pattern. At times, the reporting from the line was as precise as a map coordinate. At other moments, it was the rough language of men trying to survive. The battery commanders and the fire direction center performed their part with grim skill, compensating for wind, for snow, and for the shaky geometry of a battlefield that shifted under the weight of tanks. Ammunition stocks were strained. Some batteries expended large portions of ready rounds in attempts to blunt the surge. Requests for additional rounds moved up the chain, and nearby units were diverted to help. These logistical pressures mattered, but they did not stop the work. For 3 hours, Connor remained in that ditch, the handset a small, vital thing that transformed his eyesight into the artillery's will. Over that time, the pattern of German losses and disorganization became clear. Tigers that had rolled confidently into the field became unsupported hulks or beasts with smoking tracks. In several cases, crews left their vehicles, abandoning them to the snow and to the flames of nearby impacts. Some tanks were rendered immobile by damage to their running gear. Others were left after a driver or crewman judged they could not continue. The phrase used in reports, destroyed or abandoned, captured the ambiguous outcome of fighting heavy armor with field artillery under the best circumstances. Sometimes the enemy vehicle burned or broke down. Sometimes the crew simply walked away under the pressure of effective nearby fire, and sometimes recovery by the enemy became impossible under immediate conditions of battle. The combined effect was decisive. What had threatened to sweep the American line into collapse fragmented under the sustained guided punishment. Infantry elements that had been counted on to exploit a breach were mauled in assembly areas. Officers found it impossible to coordinate across fields torn by barrages. The Tigers lost their essential quality of mobility and became liabilities when crews exited them under fire. The attack, which had begun as a coordinated effort of armor and men, dissolved into disjointed attempts to salvage machines and to drag wounded away through smoke. At a few critical moments, the forces closing in seemed to press within what could only be described as inches rather than yards. It was then that Connor pushed the calculus to its limit. When armored vehicles and enemy infantry converged near the American positions and the chance of a successful breakthrough grew acute, he ordered missions that placed rounds perilously close. Those orders were not blurted. They were precise and repeated adjustments that called for danger-close fire, the kind of mission where the projectile's impact could be within the area occupied by friendly troops. It meant that the guns would use proximity as a weapon of last resort, accepting the immediate risk of friendly impacts to deny the enemy an advantage that would have jeopardized the entire battalion. The barrage that followed these calls was severe. Shells struck in patterns designed to stop tracked vehicles and to break up attempts at infantry assault. They landed close enough that men in foxholes felt the concussive wash, as if the world itself had moved. Ice and soil flew like a sudden second winter. Metal sang. The ditch that had given Connor sight now took the punishment of his decisions. Splinters and snow peppered the lip. Yet the artillery did what it was required to do. Tigers were forced to withdraw from effective lines of advance, immobilized by track damage or by crews choosing to flee the danger. Infantry that had hoped to exploit gaps found themselves confronted by a killing field that had been tightly measured and ruthlessly enforced. The morning's crescendo reached a point where the attackers' organized push broke. The 6 Tigers that had started the assault were, by the end of the action, either destroyed, immobilized, or abandoned. In the tumult and the broken ground that followed, some were visibly damaged and some sat silent with open hatches and empty interiors. The infantry that had come up behind them suffered heavy losses where they had tried to move through zones of concentrated fire. By the time the smoke thinned and the trees no longer hid the shapes of damaged vehicles, the German assault had collapsed into small groups withdrawing under pressure or trying to collect themselves out of range. Third Battalion held its line. The high margin between the potential of being overrun and the reality of maintaining position was the narrowest of margins, and it was a margin bought by a combination of accurate fire and a single forward observer who refused to leave the dangerous vantage that allowed him to see. The immediate aftermath was chaotic but survivable. Medics worked, wounded were evacuated as quickly as terrain and enemy fire permitted, and men in foxholes took stock, counting themselves lucky and mourning quietly for those who had been lost. The battalion had sustained casualties, several killed and more wounded, but it had avoided the catastrophe of being overrun and encircled. When reports were filed and recommendations initiated, Connor's role stood out. His actions that morning, slung wire, crossing nearly 400 yards of open ground to get an observation post, and 3 solid hours of calling in artillery that culminated in danger-close missions onto and around his own position, became the frame through which commanders and historians would assess the event. Field reports noted the sequence of decisions and the tactical effects. Enemy infantry mauled, heavy armor immobilized or abandoned, and the battalion intact where without such concerted correction it might not have been. For that conduct he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The decoration, presented by Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, recognized an extraordinary level of heroism and leadership under direct enemy threat. The citation and formal paperwork recorded the facts of that day: the run with the handset and wire, the forward position, the repeated fire direction calls, and the decisive contribution to the battalion's survival. A recommendation for the Medal of Honor followed the event, but wartime paperwork and the rhythms of rotation and discharge meant that the immediate push toward the service's highest decoration did not proceed to final approval. Connor returned home after the war, and like so many who had endured such unthinkable hours, put the war's medals away in a box. He returned to civilian life in the way of many small-town veterans. He farmed, he worked the soil, and he kept his service largely to himself. Those who knew him later described a quiet man who rarely spoke at length about the war, and who, when asked, would deflect attention away from his own actions. The box of decorations, tangible memory of dangerous days, stayed in a drawer or attic, a private inventory that symbolized a life both ordinary and made extraordinary by a single day. Years passed. Names of places like Kamar Pocket and Husan receded into the past, reappearing in occasional unit histories or in the lists kept by regimental associations. But the story of the January action did not entirely vanish. It waited in reports, in after-action reviews, and in the memory of men who had been there. For some families and for a handful of researchers it remained a question. Had Connor's conduct received the full recognition his recommendation had sought? That question is how Richard Chilton entered the Ark. Chilton, a veteran and researcher, began to examine unit records and medal files in the decades after the war. He identified cases where he believed the process had not fully honored battlefield recommendations. Connor's name surfaced in those reviews. Chilton's inquiries, methodical, archival, and persistent, began to pull together documentation that suggested an award downgrade or a stalled Medal of Honor process had left Connor shortchanged in official recognition. It was the kind of painstaking work that can reopen closed files, comparing timetables, cross-checking unit logs, and compiling witness statements still surviving in records. Parallel to that archival work, the human heart of the story continued in the life of Pauline Connor. She was Connor's wife and, after his death, the chief advocate for recognition. Pauline pressed for what redress the system might provide: appeals, hearings, and renewed recommendations. Bureaucracy is rarely swift in its amends, especially when decades have passed and statutes of limitations or time limitations on awards exist. The case required demonstration of both merit and procedural grounds for reconsideration. Legal arguments and administrative requests moved through channels that are by design conservative, seldom overturning past decisions except in the face of unequivocal evidence. In this instance, the evidence assembled by Chilton and the advocacy by Pauline joined to create a path forward. Political and military institutions reviewed files. Advocates on behalf of Connor argued that the actions of January 24, 1945, met the standard and that the historical record warranted the highest honor. The process would not be quick. It involved legal reviews, a waiver of the ordinary time limits on the consideration for the Medal of Honor, and interagency coordination. It involved endorsements from historians, support from veterans organizations, and the assent of senior officials who balanced precedent against the persistence of evidence. Finally, in a ceremony held many years after Connor's death, the Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously, presented to Pauline Connor in recognition of her husband's valor and of the long effort to correct the historical record. The award in 2018 did not retroactively change the immediate facts of a frozen field or the 3 hours of dangerous corrections. Rather, it placed a final seal of national recognition on actions that had already been recorded in the archives. The ceremony acknowledged the paradox of a man who had risked everything and then lived out his days in quiet humility. It acknowledged the work of a researcher who pursued the case and of a widow who refused to let the story be lost. It was an act of ceremonial justice, a country's belated answer to the question of how it remembers extraordinary service. Yet recognition, even when won, cannot fully translate the sensory reality of the field back into ordinary language. Decorations close a procedural loop. They do not reconstitute the frozen ground or restore the men who did not return. They do, however, ensure that names remain in the record and that future generations can find them and read the precise details. That on January 24, 1945, a first lieutenant crossed open terrain with nearly 400 yards of telephone wire and a handset. That he took a shallow ditch roughly 30 yards forward of his own line. That for 3 hours he directed artillery fire so close to friendly positions that it ultimately forced the attackers to abandon at least some of their heaviest equipment and accept heavy casualties, and that the immediate confirmed German dead numbered 53, with estimates of total killed and wounded higher. The story leaves several unavoidable truths in the open. War forces arithmetic and moral decision-making into the same cramped space. Commanders and soldiers must choose between imperfect options, and sometimes the choice involves using weapons in ways that threaten those the weapons aim to protect. Connor's decision, measured in radio calls, in bearing lines, and in the precise timing of salvos, embodied that painful calculus. He converted sight into saving. He converted risk into a managed, necessary danger. There is also the persistent lesson about memory and recognition. Too many deeds that had decisive effects on small days were never fully ensured with public honor. Files got lost, or priorities moved, or the fog of bureaucracy settled over heroic recommendations. Part of what the delayed Medal of Honor to Connor's family acknowledged was not just a single act, but a systemic tendency to obscure individual deeds in the larger sweep of conflict. The work of a private researcher and a devoted spouse exposed that obscuration and forced a re-examination. And there is the human paradox of the man himself. Someone who had performed a deed that, by measure of its consequence, would seem to crave public attention, but who preferred to step back and lead a quiet life. Connor's medals lay in a box. His story might have remained a footnote if not for those who insisted on reopening it. He had, in the cruelest but perhaps most honest way, demonstrated the stoic modesty that often accompanies bravery. Action taken because it was required, recognition accepted or not as the world would decide. The wider significance of this particular episode touches on how small choices by single individuals can alter wider outcomes. A man with a wire and a handset, stepping into a shallow ditch and refusing to leave, managed to convert the terrible mechanical advantage of heavy armor into a precarious, beatable series of problems. That individual choice reverberated across frozen fields and changed the fate of a battalion. It also calls forward an ethical awareness about how we remember and how we honor. There are fallen and those who returned, and there are stories that require patient retrieval from records and memory. The act of repatriating recognition, of arguing years later that a deed deserves the nation's highest tribute, is a form of historical stewardship. It says that nations must be willing to look back, to correct and to tell the fuller truth about what happened on hard days, so that the living understand what was risked and what was gained. To the soldiers in foxholes that morning there would have been no ceremonial language, only the shock of near misses, the numbness of cold, the sound of tank engines, and the smell of spent propellant. The story of the phone wire and the ditch translates those horizons into a narrative we can pass on. It teaches that command can sometimes look like a man on his stomach, eyes forward, voice steady, choosing to bring fire into a place where friends stood because the alternative was collapse. Connor's example also speaks to the broader dynamics of leadership. He was an infantry intelligence officer by role, not a commander sitting well behind lines. His action asked the question of what leadership looks like when structures have been damaged by war. Leadership, in that sense, revealed itself as presence and function. He saw what others could not and acted in a way that let distant guns do the guarding of a front. That is a narrow technical form of heroism, measured in bearing corrections and ammo requests rather than rhetorical gestures, that nevertheless produced strategic results. When historians and family members recount the day, they often return to simple measurements: 400 yards of wire, a ditch 30 yards forward, 3 hours of observation, 6 Tigers involved in the attack, 53 confirmed enemy dead in the immediate action, and estimates of total enemy casualties higher. Those are the incontrovertible pieces that allow the larger story to sit firmly within the facts. Around those facts sit the human details. A private wounded while helping, medics racing across fields, men in foxholes counting losses and thanking a cautious luck. A man who kept a box of medals in an attic, a researcher who would not let the file remain unexamined, a widow who pressed for the honor she felt had been deserved. The final somber frame of this history is gratitude and remembrance. A single soldier's decision, to run, to remain, to call the guns where they hurt his own side as well as the enemy, saved a battalion from being overwhelmed that morning. It is that decision that centers the claim in the title. When 6 Tiger tanks and roughly 600 German soldiers pushed forward, a wounded lieutenant called artillery on his own position to save everyone. The act did not annihilate the enemy without cost. It did not leave the ground untouched by loss, but it did change the tactical reality enough to prevent catastrophe. Today, the record preserves that fact. The award presented in 2018 to Pauline Connor closed a long loop of recognition and remembered the man who had acted in the ditch. It also invites us to reflect on how we keep and reawaken memory, through files, through persistence, through the insistence that certain deeds matter enough to be re-examined. In that sense, the story is not only about a battlefield decision, but about civic duty to the past, to ensure that bravery does not fade into anonymity because of paperwork or time. If this history has touched you, consider passing it along. Memory is kept alive not only by medals on mantles, but by stories told and retold, so that new generations can measure the costs and the choices that defined past days. Share this account with someone who values the intersection of tactical skill and personal courage, or seek out the primary sources if you want to read the official reports that recorded the details of January 24th, 1945. Remember that on a frozen field in the Khimar pocket, a man with a handset and a length of wire turned sight into salvation, and that action, measured, dangerous, and decisive, changed the fate of many.